BIOS, the bridge between hardware and software. Hi everyone. Today we'll explore a critical yet often overlooked component of your computer, the BIOS. Whether you're troubleshooting a boot issue, overclocking your CPU, or just curious about how your PC starts up, understanding BIOS is essential. Let's dive in. What is BIOS? Key functions, how it works, BIOS versus UEFI, why it matters. 2. What is BIOS? BIOS, Basic Input-Output System. BIOS is firmware stored on a chip on your motherboard. It's the first code your computer runs when you press the power button. Traditionally stored on a ROM chip, modern BIOS uses flash memory for updates. It acts as a translator between your hardware and operating system. Without BIOS, your computer wouldn't know how to start. 3. Key functions of BIOS. Core functions. Post, hardware setup, boot process, configuration 1. Power on self-test. Post. When you turn on your PC, BIOS checks critical hardware, CPU, RAM, storage, keyboard. If something's wrong, it beeps or shows an error code. Example, no RAM? BIOS halts the boot and beeps repeatedly. 2. Hardware initialization. BIOS configures components using settings stored in CMOS, a small memory chip powered by the motherboard battery. This includes setting CPU speed, enabling USB ports, or detecting your GPU. 3. Boot process management. BIOS finds your OS by checking the boot order, HDD, SSD, USB. It loads the bootloader, which then starts Windows, Linux, etc. 4. BIOS setup. Utility. Ever pressed F2 or delete during startup? That's the BIOS menu. Here, you can tweak settings like overclocking or setting a boot password. As a part of interaction, let me ask you a question. How many of you have accidentally opened the BIOS menu? 4. How BIOS works. Let's walk through the boot process step by step. 1. Power on. The CPU runs the BIOS code from the firmware chip. Second post. Checks hardware. If okay, proceeds. If not, stops with an error. 3. Hardware setup. Applies CMOS settings, e.g. time date, fan speeds. 4. Boot device selection. Follows the boot order to find an OS. 5. Handoff to bootloader. BIOS loads the boot sector, MBR-GPT, into memory and hands control to the OS. Think of BIOS as a conductor orchestrating the startup symphony of your computer. 5. Why BIOS matters. Importance. The foundation of your PC. Critical for booting. No BIOS, SARS, no OS. It's the bridge between hardware and software. Hardware control. Need to add a new GPU or troubleshoot a drive? BIOS detects and configures it. Customization. Gamers and IT pros rely on BIOS for overclocking, virtualization, or security settings. Real-world example. Installing a new OS. You'll need BIOS to set the USB drive as the first boot device. 6th. Evolution to UEFI. BIOS versus UEFI. Key differences. UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Modern replacement for BIOS, with a graphical interface, mouse support, and faster boot times. Advantages. 1. Supports drives larger than 2 terabytes, GPT partitioning. 2. Secure boot blocks malware from hijacking the boot process. 3rd. Modular design for adding drivers, e.g. network support. 7. BIOS limitations and takeaways. Legacy limitations. BIOS can't handle drives over 2 terabytes and lacks advanced security features. Security risks. BIOS firmware can be hacked, example rootkits, so updates are critical. Takeaway. BIOS is the unsung hero of your computer. While UEFI is taking over, understanding BIOS helps you troubleshoot, optimize, and secure your system. Call to action. Next time your PC acts up, don't panic. Check the BIOS. Thank you. Remember, BIOS is your gateway to mastering your computer's hardware. Stay curious and happy troubleshooting.